Margaret Cawston copied the Harmer's letters at threepence, a folio. She did it in a back room with no fire. And on the night the whole family agreed she could never have written the most talked-of book in England, she inked one comma, straightened the page, and said nothing at all. 14 people sat at that dinner. Louisa Harmer tapped the novel's cover and said, "Depend upon it, the author is a clergyman of wide experience. No woman's hand could manage that scene." 3 feet from his elbow, on the sideboard, her fresh copy of his son's law papers lay drying in the candlelight. Later that season, his daughter crossed the room. She laid her own manuscript in Margaret's lap. "Fair copy this for me," she said. And Margaret, reading the first page, could not stop the note she began to write in the margin. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go further, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now, back to Norwich. It was the winter of 1846. Norwich then was a city of wool and thread, of narrow lanes that ran down to the river, of chimneys that smoked all day and warmed the rooms of people who could pay for coal. Margaret Cawston was 38 years old. She was respectable. She was poor. And in that city, those two things pulling against each other left a woman only a very few things she was allowed to do. She could copy. That was the trade. A respectable woman, fallen just far enough, could take in copying and keep her name unstained. She could sit alone in a hired room and turn other people's words into clean, fair hands, and no one would think the less of her for it. A shopgirl was seen. A seamstress ruined her eyes and her back both, but a copyist worked unseen, behind a door, and handed out finished pages through it. For a woman who had learnt to prize being unseen, it suited her better than she liked to admit. She advertised in the Norwich Mercury. One line, set small. Fair copying, correspondence and legal papers, executed with dispatch. Threepence the folio. It was the lowest rate printed in the whole column. She had made it the lowest on purpose. She could not afford to be chosen second. The back room she hired was up a stair behind a chandler's shop off Pottergate. It had one window that faced a brick wall. It had a table, a stool, a shelf and a grate. The grate she almost never lit. Coal was 4pence the day if she was careful, and 4pence was more than a folio, and a folio was work, and warmth was not. So she wore mittens with the fingers cut away. She wrapped her feet in an old shawl under the table. She breathed on her hands when the ink began to thicken in the cold. And she went on. She was punctual. She was exact. In 4 years, no client had ever caught her in an error, a blot, or a late delivery. When a lawyer sent her 60 folios of a disputed will and swore the whole matter turned on there being not one slip, she sent them back at the hour, named with not one slip in them. He paid her, and told her she wrote a better hand than his clerk, and went on paying his clerk 4 times what he paid her. That was the way of it. She had stopped expecting the way of it to change. I want you to like her before you meet the people who did not. So hold this in your mind. A cold room. A straight back. A woman who never once was late, and never once complained, and never once was thanked past the coin counted into her palm. The Harmers came to her by way of the wool. Louisa Harmer was a merchant of good standing. He bought fleeces from half of Norfolk and sold worsted to half of London, and he had the house on the good side of the street to prove it. He had a wife, Charlotte, who ran that house as a woman runs a shop window, everything in it arranged to be seen. He had a son, Edmund, reading for the law, careful and quiet and hungry for his father's good word. And he had a daughter, Louisa, 19, quick-eyed, who read 3 novels a week and hid a 4th she was writing under the lining of her workbox. The son needed law papers copied, a great many of them, pleadings, abstracts, deeds a student must reproduce in his own hand until the forms sit in his memory. Edmund's own hand was slow, and he grudged the hours. And the household had its letters besides, invitations, orders to tradesmen, the long, careful notes Charlotte sent to families she wished to dine with. So they wanted a copyist to come to the house 2 or 3 days in the week, to sit in the morning room and work through the pile, while the clerkly labour of the family went on around her. They found Margaret's line in the Mercury. They found her rate the cheapest. Louisa Harmer, who prided himself on a shrewd bargain, engaged the cheapest copyist in town without ever once wondering why the cheapest should also be the best. So Margaret began to come to the house. She was given a corner, a small table by the window in the morning room, a little away from the fire, but a fire in the same room all the same, which was more warmth than she had at home, and which she was grateful for and ashamed of being grateful for. She came at 9. She copied until the light went, and the family lived their day around her as though she were another piece of the furniture that had come with the lease. They were not cruel to her. That is the thing I want you to understand. It would be an easier story if they had been cruel. They simply did not see her. Charlotte passed her in the doorway and did not slow. Josiah dictated a letter over her shoulder and never learned the shape of her face. Edmund set a fresh stack of papers by her elbow and said these next and went away again. When they spoke to her at all, it was to hand her more folios. She was the hand that copied. She was not, to them, a person who might have a thought worth the hearing, and Margaret let them think it. That was her craft too, by now. To be there and not there. To take up no space. To be so quiet and so useful that no one ever asked the question that would have undone everything. She had trained herself into invisibility for years, and she had trained so hard that on the bad days she more than half believed she deserved to be invisible. That is the wound this story turns on. Keep your eye on it. Because Margaret Cawston had a second life, and the Harmers were sitting inside it and did not know. In the evenings, when she left Pottergate and climbed the stair to her cold room, she did not stop working. She lit a single candle. She took a different kind of paper from the shelf, paper that was hers and not a client's. And she wrote. Some nights when the writing was done and the pages were dry, she folded them and sealed them into a packet. And she carried that packet, after dark, the short way through the lanes to a shop on the corner. The shop belonged to Silas Dunmo, bookseller, a careful man with careful eyes, who asked no questions he wasn't paid to ask. She handed the sealed packet across his counter. He wrote a line in a book, and he said, every time, the same small words. For the London coach. That was all. A woman in a plain bonnet leaves a sealed packet at a bookshop after dark, and a quiet man sends it up to London by the morning coach. If you were a neighbour, you would have thought nothing of it. If you were the Harmers, you would not have thought of it at all, because you never once wondered where the copyist went at night. But I am asking you to file it away. The sealed packet. The London coach. We will need it. Now to the dinner. It was a good dinner, the kind Charlotte lived for. 14 at the table, the best of the family's connections, the candles doubled, the plate out. Margaret was not a guest. Margaret was working late in the morning room that adjoined, finishing a fair copy of Edmund's pleadings that he wanted clean by the morning, and the door between stood open so that a girl could carry dishes through. So she heard it all. She sat at her small table with her pen going, and the warm, loud talk of the dinner came through the open door, and she was near enough to catch every word, and far enough that not one of them thought she was there. The talk came round, as all the talk in England came round that winter, to the book. A Woman of No Estate. The sensation of the season. Everyone had read it or was pretending to. It had run through 3 editions since the summer. People argued about its ending in drawing rooms from Norwich to Bath. And no one knew who had written it, for the title page said only by a lady, which half the reading public took for a modesty and the other half took for a trick. Because surely, they said, surely no lady really wrote that. Josiah Harmer had a view. Josiah Harmer had a view on most things, and he delivered them the way he weighed a fleece, with the full confidence of a man who has never once been shown to be wrong to his face. "I'll tell you who wrote it," he said, and he tapped the cover of the very copy that lay by his plate. "Read that scene in the 3rd volume. The trial, the law of it, the weight of it, the way the man carries the whole courtroom in a paragraph. That is not guessing. That is a man who has sat in such a room and watched such a thing. Depend upon it, the author is a clergyman of wide experience, a man who has seen the world and the worst of it. No woman's hand could manage that scene." And round the table the heads nodded. Of course. Of course. A clergyman, a man of experience. It was so obviously true that no one thought to test it. Charlotte said she had always felt there was something of the pulpit in it. A guest said the moral weight alone proved it. They built the man up between them, brick by brick, out of nothing but their own certainty, gave him his living, his years, his wide, sad knowledge of the world, and they were all very pleased with him. In the next room, at her small table, the woman who had written that trial scene dipped her pen. There was a comma missing in Edmund's 3rd line. She inked it in. She let the page dry. She said nothing at all. I want you to sit inside that quiet for a moment, because it is the whole story in a single breath. She had spent 3 weeks on that courtroom. She had walked to the assizes twice and stood at the back to hear how a real barrister let a silence do his work. She had cut the scene and cut it again until it held. And a wool merchant 3 feet from her elbow had just explained to a room of 14 people that she could not possibly have done the thing she had done, and then filled her empty place on the title page with a grand imaginary man. And she inked a comma. And she said nothing, because saying something was not among the few things a poor, respectable woman was allowed to do. Now come close to the table where she worked, because I want to show you something the Harmers never looked at. Her right hand, the middle finger of it, was stained dark at the side, a deep ingrained ink grey that no washing had lifted in 20 years. That was the copyist's mark, the writer's mark, the callus and the stain of a hand that had held a pen more hours than it had held anything else. And watch the letters that hand made. She wrote a particular D, the upstroke looped back on itself at the top, a small closed curl she had made since she was a girl and never broke. And her G ran a long tail, longer than the hand of any writing master would have taught, a tail that swept down and hooked left like a signature inside every word. Anyone who knew that D and that G would know her writing anywhere. Anyone, on a letter, on a copied pleading. In the margin of a book, on a single loose leaf of a famous manuscript. The Harmers had thousands of folios in her hand about the house. Edmund's whole course of law was written in that looped D and that long-tailed G. They handled the evidence every day. They just never once read it as evidence, because it never crossed their minds there was a crime. The season went on, and the book would not die down, and one evening it caught Margaret out in the open. There were guests again, fewer this time, taking tea in the drawing-room, and Margaret had been kept late and was gathering her copied sheets to leave. Louisa saw her by the door. And Louisa, who was 19 and quick and a little bored, and though none of them knew it yet, the one person in that house whose eyes actually worked, decided on a piece of mischief. "Miss Cawston copies half the letters in Norwich," Louisa said, lightly to the room. "She must read more hands than a schoolmaster." "Miss Cawston, you've surely read the famous book. What do you make of it?" "Papa says a clergyman wrote it." "Do you agree?" The room turned, not with real interest, with the amused, tolerant attention people give a servant who has been invited, as a novelty, to have an opinion. Charlotte's face went carefully bland. Josiah half smiled, ready to be indulgent. Margaret stood with her sheets against her chest. She could have said the safe thing. She had said the safe thing 1,000 times. She meant to, but they were talking about her book. And just this once, some small starved part of her that she had starved on purpose reached up and took the single sixpence of an opening she was offered. "I think," she said, quietly, "that the book is built backward, that the author wrote the last chapter first and laid every scene before it as a step toward that one room. The trial everyone praises isn't the strong part, it's the plain scene 2 chapters on, where she says nothing and lets him misunderstand her. The trial is loud so that the quiet scene can land. That is the whole design of it. It was exact. It was true. It was, in fact, precisely the design. Because she had drawn it. For one held breath the room felt the accuracy of it, the way you feel a bell struck true. Then Josiah laughed. Not unkindly. That was the worst of it. He laughed the warm, easy laugh of a man setting a small thing back in its small place. "A pretty guess," he said. "Very pretty. You've a quick fancy, Miss Cawston, I'll grant you. But these are matters for readers of a different sort, for those of us with a little more of the world behind us. No, depend upon it, a clergyman's behind that book. A woman might feel a scene. She could never build one." And he turned back to his guests and went on about his imaginary clergyman, pleased with himself, and the moment closed over Margaret's head like water. Her own book. Explained back to her, by a man who had paid her 6pence for the afternoon's work, in front of company, so that agreeing with her would have cost him nothing, and he chose to laugh instead. She gathered her sheets. She said good night to no one in particular, and no one in particular answered, and she went out into the cold and walked home with the whole design of a woman of no estate folded quiet inside her chest where it had always lived. There is a thing Josiah did, not long after, that I have to show you, because it is the cruelest joke in the whole story, and none of them ever heard the joke. He had come by a treasure, and he could not stop showing it. At a charity sale in London, the kind of sale where a great publishing house clears out its old lumber and lets the proceeds go to some worthy cause. A lot of discarded manuscript papers had gone under the hammer, working drafts, spoiled sheets, leaves the house had done with. And among them, catalogued as from the sensation of the season, was a single loose leaf in the author's own hand. Josiah had paid 1 shilling for it. 1 shilling. He had it framed, and now he brought it out for company. He would fetch it down and pass it round the table with the reverence of a man handling a relic. A page from the book itself, he'd say, in the great man's own hand. Look at the strength of the writing. You can see the mind at work, see how sure the pen is. That is genius on the page, that is. 1 shilling. I count it the best shilling I ever spent, and the leaf went round the table, hand to hand, and everyone bent over it and murmured, and saw in the strong, sure penmanship exactly the great experienced man they had already decided upon. I need you to see what was actually on that leaf, because the whole room was looking straight at the answer, and not one of them could read it. The looped D. The long-tailed G. It was Margaret's hand. Of course it was Margaret's hand. She had written the book, and this was a discarded page of her own draft, sold off as rubbish by the very London house that had bought her work, gone into a shilling lot, and come home to Norwich to be framed and adored under the nose of the woman who'd inked it. She had, more than once, sat copying in the corner of the very room where Josiah passed her own handwriting round the table, calling it the hand of a great man. She had watched her own G go from palm to palm. She had said nothing. What, in God's name, was there to say? Now the money, because the money is where the second colder wound is, and the money is why she was still copying at 3pence a folio while they quoted her at dinner. A packet came to Dunmo's for her, not one going up to London this time. One come down from it. Silas handed it across the counter with his careful eyes and said nothing, and she carried it home unopened and did not light the candle for a long while after she'd shut the door, because she knew what it was, and she was not ready. It was the half-yearly account from Coldstream and Marsh, publishers, of Paternoster Row. You must understand how she had been paid. She had not sold the book outright. She had not known enough, 4 years ago, frightened and hopeful and unrepresented, to demand it. She had signed what a poor unknown woman is given to sign. A half-profits agreement. It sounds fair. It sounds like partnership. Half the profits to the house, half to the author, share and share alike. It is one of the great quiet swindles of the trade, and here is how it works. Before the profits are halved, the house takes off its costs. And the house decides what the costs are, and the house owns the pen that writes them down. So Margaret unfolded the account at last, and read it by the one candle, and this is what the sensation of the season had earned the woman who wrote it. Against her side of the ledger they had charged advertising, every notice in every paper, set down at the full rate and doubled where they pleased. They had charged corrections, the printer's own errors, put right at her expense. They had charged warehousing, for the storing of the very editions the town was fighting to buy. They had charged commission on the charging. Line after line, in a clean clerk's hand, the money the book had made was eaten away before it ever reached the word profit, and only what survived that feast was halved, and half of it sent down to Norwich. Her share, for the half-year, of the most talked-of novel in England, came to £11, 4 shillings. £11, 4 shillings. She sat with it in the cold, and did the sum a copyist does without thinking. £11 was some hundreds of folios. It was weeks of work at the little table by the window. The trial scene the whole country praised, the quiet scene she was proudest of in her life, the 3 editions, the arguments in 100 drawing-rooms, and it came back to her as £11 and 4 shillings, and a bad chest from a room she still could not afford to heat. That is why she was there. That is why the finest hand in Norwich was still copying law papers at the cheapest rate in the Mercury and carrying her own genius past a merchant's dinner 3 feet away. Not because she was a fool, because the men who published her had taken the book's money coming and going, and the men who employed her had never once thought to look at her, and between the two of them a woman could write the sensation of the season and still keep her mittens on indoors to save the coal. And Josiah was not done with the joke. He read to them from the paper one morning, Margaret in her corner copying, a paragraph about the book's enormous sale, the editions, the demand, the fortune such a success must be pouring out. There, he said, and folded the paper with satisfaction, holding it up as if it settled an argument no one had made. You see what a man of parts may earn by his pen, a fortune, and a name that will outlast us all. That is what education and experience will do, given the gift to go with it. He said it with real feeling, admiring the invisible man, admiring the fortune, holding the paper like proof. In her corner Margaret went on copying. Under her apron, folded small against her, was the account. £11. 4 shillings. She did not look up. Her looped D and her long-tailed G went across Edmund's page, even and clean, and the fortune of a man of parts sat listening in the same room and made not one sound. Now, gently, the story turns. Because there was one person in that house whose eyes worked, and she was about to do the small trusting thing that brings the whole roof down. Louisa found Margaret alone one afternoon, hung about a moment, and then, going quite pink, took a fat wrapped bundle from under her arm and set it on the little table. "I want to tell you something I've told no one," she said, low and fast. "I'm writing a novel. A real one. 3 volumes. I've near finished the first." She pressed her hand flat on the bundle as if it might bolt. "But my hand is a fright, and I daren't have it copied at a public office where it be talked of, and you write the most beautiful hand I've ever seen, Miss Cawston. And you copy things all day and never speak a word of what's in them. Will you fair copy it for me? In secret. I'll pay you fair, better than fair, please, and she pushed the manuscript across the table into Margaret's lap. Something in Margaret went very still, a girl who wanted to be a real author. Trusting the beautiful hand, not knowing, how could she know, that she had just handed her clumsy, hopeful first novel to the one woman in England best able to read it. Margaret looked down at the untidy pages in her lap, at a 19-year-old's dream badly spelled and bravely done, and something under her ribs that had been folded small for 4 years began, very slowly, to unfold. That night she did not seal a packet for the London coach. She lit the candle, and she drew Louisa's manuscript to her, and she began to fair copy it into her own clean hand. And here is the deed. Watch it closely, because everything that comes after grows from this one quiet thing, and she does it without a plan, without a scheme, without the smallest thought of being found. She read as she copied, and she was a novelist. She could no more read a sagging scene and leave it sagging than a doctor could watch a man choke and fold his hands. Louisa had a good instinct and a bad third chapter. The girl had buried her strongest moment under 3 weak ones. She had a character who turned too fast, a chapter that ended flat where a single held line would have hooked the reader clean into the next. Margaret's pen slowed. She copied the page fair, as asked, and then, in the margin, in the small looped D and the long-tailed G she had written since she was a girl, she wrote a note. Then another. She could not help it. Not to reveal herself, the thought of revealing herself never once entered her head, simply because she could not watch a young writer fail a page she knew, in her bones, exactly how to save. She wrote where the scene sagged and why. She wrote how to turn the chapter so it pulled instead of stopped. She wrote generous, expert, unmistakable notes, the notes of the author of A Woman of No Estate. Page after page, deep into the cold small hours, filling the margins of Louisa Harmer's first novel with her whole hidden self. And in the morning she wrapped it up, and she carried it to the house, and she laid it back in the delighted girl's hands without a word of warning about what was written down the sides of every page. She had signed nothing. She had confessed nothing. She had only, at last, been unable to keep silent on paper. She had no idea what she had just done. She did not sleep well that night, though she did not know why. The cold had settled into her chest again, the way it did every winter, and she lay listening to it whistle. She told herself it was the damp. It was not the damp. Somewhere under her ribs a thing had shifted, and she would not name it, and so it kept her awake until the grey came up over the rooftops. In the morning Louisa opened the packet at her writing desk, expecting only a clean copy. She found the margins. She read the first note. Then the second. Then she stopped reading like a girl and started reading like a writer. Because whoever had written down the side of her third chapter had seen the thing she herself had felt and could not fix. The scene that sagged, the character who turned too fast, and beside each fault, in a small looped hand, was the cure, not a scolding, a gift. She read every note twice. She was 19. She had shown the manuscript to no one but a copyist, and the copyist had handed it back transfigured. It is as though, she said aloud, to no one, the author of my own favourite book leaned over my shoulder. She could not keep it. That was the whole trouble with Louisa. Joy in her ran straight to her mouth. By noon she had carried the pages down to the morning room, and by 3 she had shown them to her mother. And by dinner she had put them into her father's hands. Look, Papa, look what was written in the margins. Josiah Harmer took the pages the way he took everything, as a man receiving his due. He read one note. His eyebrows moved. He read another. Well, he said. Well, now Charlotte leaned to see. What is it? Craft, said Josiah. This is craft, Charlotte. Look how the hand advises the turn of the chapter. This is not a governess correcting spelling. This is a masterly hand. He held a page to the candle, "Where did you get this, Louisa?" And here the girl faltered, because the secret of her novel was still a secret, and she did not wish to give it up at the table. "A friend read it," she said. "A friend who reads a great deal." "A friend with a rare eye," said Josiah, and passed the page along, and the family bent over it as they had bent over the framed relic on the wall. And none of them looked toward the corner where the copyist worked 3 feet from the sideboard, inking a comma into a letter, saying nothing. That was the thing you must hold in your mind now. She was in the room, she was always in the room, and they marvelled at her hand while they handed her more folios and did not once turn their heads. For 3 weeks it went on like that, and every day the irony wound tighter. Edmund read the notes at breakfast one morning, slowly, the way he read a contract. "There is something in the phrasing," he said. He frowned. "I have read phrasing like this before. In 100 reviews, I should think," said his father. "No," Edmund tapped the page. "Closer than that. I cannot place it." He set it down. He would remember, later, that he had come within an inch and looked away. Charlotte had her own verdict, delivered over the soup. "It reads above a copyist, whoever it is," she said. Far above. Louisa's friend must be a lady of some education. She said the word copyist the way she always said it, as a thing you paid and forgot, and across the room Margaret's pen did not pause, and the ink went on drying on the sideboard. They kept setting the trap around her and stepping over it. Margaret felt the pressure like weather coming. She had not meant this. She reminded herself of that in the cold, small hours she had meant only to save a young writer's 3rd chapter. But she had signed her whole self down the side of every page, and now her whole self was being passed hand to hand at the Harmer table, admired, quoted, held to the candle. And she could not take it back. You cannot unwrite a margin. When they asked her, Louisa asked her once, lightly, whether she had ever tried her own hand at a story, Margaret said, "I copy? Miss, I have no time for stories," and bent to her folios and hated, just a little, the ease with which the lie came after 4 years of practice. It was Louisa who undid it, and she did it out of love. She wanted, you see, to see the beautiful margin beside something equally fine. And there was only one hand in the house her father held finer, the relic on the wall. The single leaf of manuscript he had bought for 1 shilling at a London publisher's charity sale, the discarded papers of Coldstream and Marsh, framed now and hung like a saint's bone. A page from the sensation of the season, he called it. A woman of no estate, in the author's own hand. So Louisa took her father's relic down from the wall, and she laid it on the dinner table, and beside it she laid her own fair copied manuscript, open at the margin she loved best. It was a small thing. A girl comparing 2 beautiful hands, wanting to be told hers was the equal. The family gathered to look, Josiah with his glass, Charlotte at his shoulder, Edmund leaning in. The looped D, the long-tailed G, the particular slant a hand takes when the same fingers have made the same letters 10,000 times. They were the same. Not similar. The same. The relic on the table and the margin beside it had been written by one hand, and everyone bent over that table could see it, and for a long moment nobody said a word. Edmund broke it. "Fetch," he said, and stopped, and started again. "Fetch a folio of father's letters. One she copied last week. Nobody asked who she was. They all knew, suddenly, exactly who she was." The folio came. Josiah's own correspondence, in the fair copyist's hand, 3pence a folio, done in the corner while they dined. Edmund laid it as the 3rd. 3 sheets in a row now. The relic. The margin. The letter. One signature ran through all 3. The looped D. The long-tailed G. The room went very quiet, and into that quiet Margaret Cawston set down her pen. Charlotte spoke first, because Charlotte could not bear a silence that threatened her. "It is a trick," she said. Her voice was too high. A copyist studies hands all day. She has found the style. She has copied the author's manner as she copies everything. That is her trade. She looked round for agreement. She imitates. That is all she does. Imitate a manuscript she never saw, said Edmund quietly. The relic hung on the wall. Mother, the novel she praised at your table. How does she imitate a hand she was never given? Charlotte had no answer, so she gave the answer people give when they have none. It is a coincidence, she said. A coincidence of penmanship. A coincidence, Josiah repeated. He took it up gladly, because it let him keep his world. He even smiled. It was a brittle smile, the smile of a man holding a door shut against a rising wind. Yes, there are only so many ways to shape a letter, Edmund. Many hands run alike. My relic is a great man's page, bought honestly. And this, he gestured at the corner, at Margaret, without looking at her. This is a clever woman with a neat pen. The two happen to lean the same way. It is remarkable. It is nothing more. And he might have got away with it. He might have talked the whole table back into its comfort, for he was a man who had talked his way into comfort all his life. But Edmund, who understood accounts, understood proof. There is a man who would know, Edmund said. The bookseller, Dunmow, she carries packets to him. I have seen her go. He turned to his father. Send for him. They sent a boy through the dark to Silas Dunmow's shop, and they waited, and no one dined. The soup went cold in the tureen. Margaret sat in her corner, with her hands folded in her lap, her ink-stained middle finger dark against the other, and she did not run, and she did not weep, and she did not speak. She had waited 4 years. She could wait an hour more. Dunmow came in his coat, cap in hand, blinking at the candles and the grand faces. Mr. Dunmow, said Josiah, and his voice had lost some of its flaw. You forward packets to London? For persons in this town? I do, sir. It's no secret trade. Booksellers forward parcels. For this woman. Edmund nodded to the corner. Miss Cawston. What do you send, and to whom? Silas Dunmow looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him and gave, at last, the smallest nod. Permission. She had kept his arrangement quiet for 4 years. She would not have him lie for her now. Sealed packets, said Dunmow. Manuscript, by the weight and feel of them. To Paternoster Row, sir, to the house of Coldstream and Marsh, publishers, every few weeks, near enough, these 4 years past. He turned the cap in his hands. I never opened one. It weren't my business what was in them, but I know where they went, because I paid the coach myself and entered it in my book, Miss Cawston's packets. To her publisher, her publisher. 2 words. They fell on the table like a dropped plate. There was no door left to hold shut. Josiah Harmer sat down. He had been standing, now he sat, heavily, as a man sits when his legs have stopped taking instruction. He looked at the 3 sheets in their row, the relic he had bought for $1 and hung on his wall and passed round to 14 guests as the page of a great man. He had been so certain. He had filled the empty name on that famous title page with the grandest figure he could picture, a clergyman of wide experience, a man of parts, a man like himself only greater, and the whole time the name belonged to the woman who inked his letters in the cold corner for 3p a sheet. And still, the certainty had worn a groove in him so deep that the old words came up out of it by themselves, almost gently, almost to himself, the way a man says a thing he has said 1,000 times. But no woman's hand, he murmured, staring at the relic, could manage that scene. The room held its breath. Margaret Cawston rose from her corner. She did not raise her voice. She had spent 4 years learning to be quiet, and she did not spend the skill now on shouting. The hand managed it at 3p a folio, sir, she said. In your back room. That was all. She did not smile. She did not sweep her arm across the table. She let the sentence stand where she had set it, the way she set a comma, exact and final, and then she was quiet again. Nobody answered her. There was no answer. It was Edmund who moved next, and Edmund who turned the family's shame from a private thing into a reckoning, because Edmund read for the law, and the law had taught him that the worst wounds are the ones written in figures. "You are her publisher's town," he said slowly, working it out aloud. 4 years of packets. A woman of no estate has gone 3 editions since the summer. 3 editions. He looked at Margaret. "What did they pay you?" And here Margaret reached into her apron, where she had carried it folded against her all evening, all week, and set it on the table beside the relic. The half-yearly account from Coldstream and Marsh, the paper worn soft at the folds from being read in a cold room by a woman doing the sums again and again as if they might come out kinder. "Read it," she said. "You understand accounts. Read it out." Edmund took it up. He read it the way he read a pleading, without heat, which made it worse. "Statement of account," he read, on the half-profits agreement for the work entitled A Woman of No Estate. He paused. By the half-profits agreement the author bears half of all costs before any share is paid. He ran his finger down. Advertising, £52. Corrections and alterations at press, £18. Warehousing, commission on sales, charges for review copies sent out free, charges for the very paper the book is printed on, set against her share. His voice changed, just slightly. 3 editions, a season's sensation. And the author's share, when every charge is taken off, he stopped. He looked up. £11, he said. £11, 4 shillings. Charlotte made a small sound. £11 4, Edmund said again, because the figure would not sit still in his mouth. For the most talked of book in England. They charged their own advertising against her, their own corrections. They spent her money making themselves rich and handed her back £11. He set the paper down very carefully, as if it might cut him. "This is not a bad bargain, father. This is a taking. It is legal, and it is a taking, and I have copied contracts like it for you and never once read the cost of them to the person who signed." The silence after that was a different silence. The first had been disbelief. This one was shame, and it had 2 flaws to it, and everyone at the table stood on both. They had underpaid her, and the great London house they admired had robbed her long before them, and they had spent 2 years quoting the robbery as a man's triumph. Now watch them, each in turn, because they do not all break the same way, and the breaking is the point. Louisa Harmer could not look at her. That was his whole punishment, and it was exact. The man who had filled every empty space with the largest figure he could imagine, the clergyman, the man of parts, the great hand on the wall, sat with the 3 matching sheets before him and could not lift his eyes to the small grey woman, standing 3 feet from the sideboard. He had wanted all his life to be the cleverest reader at his own table. He had read everything and seen nothing. His certainty had not just failed him, it had been the very instrument of his blindness. He stared at the relic he had paid £1 shilling for and understood, at last, that he had framed her rubbish and worshipped it and stepped over her to do it. Charlotte reddened and kept reddening, because Charlotte was doing sums of her own, not of money, but of dinners. Every table she had graced with the story of the framed leaf, every guest to whom she had said, a page from the sensation of the season, in the author's own hand, while the author cleared the folios from her sideboard. She had wanted to be seen dining above her station. She had been dining above the author of the age, and had paid her 6pence for the afternoon, and thought herself generous. She would tell this story for years, Margaret knew, watching her. She would tell it as though she had always known, but tonight she only reddened, and could not stop. Edmund did not colour, and did not look away. That was his. He held the ledger in his hands, he could not seem to put it down, and he looked at Margaret full in the face, and what was in his face was the particular sickness of a clever man who has understood a thing too late. He had come within an inch of the phrasing at breakfast and turned back to his toast. He had assumed, all his life, that competence lived where status already sat, and the assumption had let a taking pass under his own copying hand. He would not make that mistake again. You could see him deciding it, right there, with the paper still open. And Louisa. Louisa crossed the room. She did not stand with her family. She got up from the table, past her stunned father, past her mother's red face, and she walked to the corner where the copyist stood, and she took Margaret's ink-stained hand in both of hers. "You wrote the notes," she said. "Not an accusation, a wonder. You wrote my margins, and you wrote a woman of no estate. And you sat here. You sat here the whole time and let my father, she could not finish it. She was 19 and something in her had grown up in the last 10 minutes. You could have let my third chapter drown. You had every reason to. And you saved it instead. You had a good instinct," Margaret said. "And a bad third chapter. The one does not cancel the other." And Louisa laughed, a wet and startled laugh, and did not let go of her hand. That was the recognition. But recognition is not yet freedom, and Margaret Cawston had not come to the end of what she meant to do. She reached into her apron a second time. She drew out a second manuscript, thicker than Louisa's, finished, a whole novel, fair copied in her own clean hand, the looped D and the long-tailed G running through every page of it. The book she had been carrying to Dunmo's counter in sealed packets these last months, the book that came after the sensation. "I have written another," she said, and laid it on the table, on top of the account, beside the relic. "It is done. Coldstream and Marsh want it. They have sent a contract." She drew that out too, a fresh, fair document, all courtesy and small print. The same agreement, half profits, the same clause. She unfolded it on the table where they could all see, and she did the thing she had never once been permitted to do with the first. She read her own contract aloud, line by line, in the exact, unhurried voice of a woman who had copied 10,000 contracts for other people and understood every word. And when she came to the half-profits clause, the clause that had charged their advertising against her, their corrections, their warehousing, until a season's sensation came back to her as £11 4, she took up the pen from her own corner, the same pen, and she drew one line through it. "No," she said, "not again. They may have the book. They may not have the clause, and they may not have my name, because my name has never been on any page, and it will not be now, but this time by my own choosing, and not their theft." She capped the pen. "I have been unsigned for 4 years, because being unsigned kept a poor woman safe. They turned my safety into a robbery. Very well. I will stay unsigned, but it will be my shield again, and not their pocket." She looked once at the framed relic, the page she had discarded years ago, thrown out as not good enough, that had travelled to a charity sale and back into a frame on a wool merchant's wall to be adored as the leavings of a great man. She had no need of it now. It had been the only proof she owned of her own hand. Once it was not any longer. She had the hand itself, and everyone in the room had seen it write. She left the relic where it lay. She folded her second manuscript back into her apron, and the struck contract with it, and she gathered her folios from the sideboard, the way she gathered them every evening, neat and square, because habit is stronger than triumph. And she went out into the Norwich dark, and no one at the table tried to stop her, because there was nothing left to say that she had not already said better in 6 quiet words. Now let me tell you how it went after, because the best part of a reckoning is the ordinary mourning that comes behind it. There was a fire. That is the first thing, and the thing she noticed most. In the room she took the following winter with the money from the new agreement, the one with no half-profits clause, the one Edmund Harmer went over line by line before she signed, unpaid, at his own insistence, because he had decided that reading contracts to the people who signed them was a debt he owed the world now. A lit grate. A poor woman who had copied by numb fingers in an unheated back room for 4 years sat in her own chair before her own fire and warmed her ink-stained hand, and it was, she thought, a very great deal of heat for one person to be allowed. The second novel came out the next season. She called it The Fair Copy. It was published on her terms, her name still absent from the title page, kept off by her own hand this time, protection and not erasure, the difference being everything. But she permitted herself one line inside. A dedication. It read, "To those who are quoted and never named." And the small fates, the dry ones, fell out like this. Josiah Harmer never quoted a novel at his dinner table again. He talked of wool and of weather and of the price of things, and if a guest raised a book, he grew suddenly interested in the fish. He had been the cleverest reader in Norwich for 30 years, in his own account. He had decided, quietly, to retire from the office. Charlotte told the story for the rest of her life, and told it exactly as Margaret had known she would, as though she had always suspected. I said from the first there was something above a copyist in that hand. I said it at this very table. And in a way she had, which was the joke of it, and which nobody corrected, because it cost nothing to let her keep it. Edmund reviewed every contract Margaret Cawston signed thereafter, and a good many that other people signed too, and he became, in time, the sort of lawyer who reads the cost of a thing aloud to the person who must bear it, whether they ask him to or not. It made him unpopular with publishers. He counted that a recommendation. And Louisa's book appeared, at last, 3 volumes, her own. The bad 3rd chapter turned at last into a good one. On its first page stood a line of thanks. To the finest hand in Norwich, it said, and everyone who read it thought it meant a printer, and Louisa let them, because some names are best kept between 2 people who both know exactly whose they are. So here is the whole of it, said Plain, the way she would have set it herself. They filled the empty name on the title page with the most important man they could imagine. A clergyman of experience, a man of parts, a great hand on the wall. They imagined him so hard and so well that they never once looked at the woman inking their letters 3 feet from the sideboard, because it never entered their heads to look down, at the corner, at the person they paid and forgot. Her silence had begun as a shield, a poor and respectable woman, keeping her name off the page, because the page was not a safe place for a woman's name to be. That was her own quiet protection, freely chosen. But in the mouths of the people who quoted her at dinner and paid the London house that robbed her, that same silence had been turned into a theft, of her credit, of her money, of her very face. They had used her invisibility to help themselves and called it her nature. And so at the end she chose the silence again, but it was a different silence now, not a hiding place they had forced her into. A door she closed herself. From the inside, with the contract read line by line, and the clause struck through, and the fire lit. Her name stayed off the page because she willed it there, and that one turn of the wrist, the same wrist, the looped D, the long-tailed G, was the whole distance between being erased and being free. She warmed her hand at her own fire, and she began the 3rd book, and she did not sign it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, you already know how this feels. So tell me, comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far Margaret's story travels.